Good morning. Hemshechayim Beis, volume 2, page 1165. The top of 1165. So I want to review what we learned yesterday, and I have some updated information. So yesterday, well, first let's put the whole thing in context. The Rebbe Rashab is discussing Atzilus. He began the mimer speaking how Atzilus, general, is Das Elyon. That's how the mimer began on the bottom of page 1161. Because Atzilus is Elikus. It sees things from the perspective of the divine, of a godliness. Then he broke it down. He said, Omnom, the emes yesh Beis deis hanal. The truth is that you have both deis, Das Elyon and Das Tachten Atzilus. For the record, a bit later, he's going to speak about how all of Atzilus is Das Tachten. So we're going to end up having, in Atzilus itself, three different ways to explain it. Das Elyon, Das Elyon and Das Tachten, and then only Das Tachten. On page 1168, he's going to say that, the next mimer, but we're not there yet. So in explaining how Atzilus has both perspectives, he went into a discussion that Atzilus is, on one hand, it's Elikus, but on the other hand, it's an Elam HaAtzilus. It's a defined world, it's a defined entity, a defined domain. So, and he's been explaining both elements in the language of Posach Eliyahu, Tikkunin and Sfirin. That the 10 spheres on one hand are like garments, which are more structured and defined, and on the other hand, spheres that are illuminating. That was the last piece on top of 1164. And then he went and introduced, there's also levushim of biyah. So to really powerfully contrast and identify the level of Atzilus, compared to Biyah, the levushim of Atzilus are obviously a higher level of garments, even though they're lower than spheres, as in the illumination of spheres. And that's what we're in the middle of right now. Understanding the levushim of Atzilus, and he compared it to, he says it's levush ha'atzmi, as opposed to a levush ha'nifrid, which we didn't get back to yet. We will discuss that soon. To explain that, he went into the example from Keiches HaNefesh, that the faculties of the soul, on one hand, they're not the core essence of the soul, as he explained, which is shapeless and poshet, without boundaries, without structure, I should say. On the other hand, or without structure in the sense of without details. On the other hand, it's keiches hanefesh. It's not external garments that you put on and off. It's expressions of the soul. And then he went even further. Not only is it expressions of the soul, but especially the higher faculties. Chochma specifically is an actual, the hashros hanefesh is there. The nefesh resides in Chochma. It's still two separate entities, but they become united. Like a mishkan. That was the words he used. Hashros vis'achdus, chochma to the nefesh. And then came the long parentheses. The long parentheses, one thing I should add, the two Tanyas. Tanya Pedic Nun Aleph, where he says that the nefesh is poshet higher than distinctions. And Pedic Gimel that says it's atzmos hanefesh, the faculty. So he explained that's relative to the three garments of thought, speech, and action. Okay. Then came the parentheses. After saying v'chochma mispashet manefesh kachel yeah. After saying that it's separate, he says elasha chochma hu hareish lekol hakeches. So now came this long parentheses, which is almost a page, that began on 1164 and concluded yesterday. We concluded the end of top of 1165. I just like to put it into context before we dive in deeper into the details. So what is the point in this parentheses? That Chochma is a particular keli, and for the words he uses is Elasha Chochma hi areish l'kol hakeches v'kol klei hanefesh. Shachochma moker habina v'amidus. Chochma is the first and the root and source of all the faculties. V'hanefesh ima yesim tzadatzim l'mayla maseichel mekol mokim. Even though the nefesh itself is higher than seichel, than intelligence, mekol mokim ikar ashra osa v'slapshusa hi b'keich haseichel. Its primary dwelling place, its primary place where it dwells and manifests and encloses itself is in the keich haseichel. And that's why the nefesh is called keich hamaskelis, because even though it's not the nefesh, but the nefesh is identified by intelligence. So there's some type of relationship that's more than just the nefesh relationship, let's say, with the toes or the lower faculties that are not chochma. Correct. In a way, you can say, if obviously the nefesh is beyond all the faculties to the point that the life force equalizes all the faculties and all parts of the body. But if, like we spoke about Eir Ein Sof, if you remember, Eir, Atzmus is beyond Eir. But Eir is nothing but an expression of Atzmus. If Atzmus was going to express himself, Eir is a channel, a field of energy that expresses the same thing here. The nefesh is beyond Chochma, but once you have Chochma, Chochma is best described, that best manifests the soul in an expressive way. If you said, for example, that we have the ability to move, the power to move about, that doesn't distinguish the nefesh of Adam, let's say, from the nefesh of an animal. But when you say seichel is in a way much more expressive, like you say, the intelligent human being. God created many creatures. What would stand out would be the intelligence. So the nefesh of Adam is most best expressed in a certain way through intelligence. That doesn't mean intelligence is the nefesh. It just means that the nefesh and intelligence, and the nefesh expresses itself most in the uniqueness of the human. In this case, is seichel. That's the point. So seichel has a much more unifying connection, whereas the nefesh is not quite as expressive. Let's say when you throw a stone, when you see a person using their mind, innovating, conceiving ideas, building things based on a certain genius or brilliance, far more expressive of the soul's power than just, let's say, throwing a stone that anybody can do. Just to amplify that a bit. Okay. Now, then when the next topic was a chochma techaya ba'aleha. So as I pointed out, I have no doubt that the parentheses, lochein, ends after the word, the next line after va'chochma. I think that people who did the editing, they saw the word chochma, so they thought since it says v'zeu va'chochma techaya ba'aleha, that it followed that second parentheses. No, I don't think that's correct. The more you read it, you see clearly, because he used already chochma before. So he says now, chochma techaya ba'aleha. What does that mean? That one hand is ba'aleha. Chochma revives, energizes, invigorates. All these words are fitting. Ba'aleha. Ba'aleha, he says, is the owners of this chochma. Literally, ba'aleha means the one who is the balabos of chochma, like we say, bar seichel, bar seichel, or bal tshuva, or like the balabos. He says bal chochma. What is that? Nefesh asal ma'al maseichel chenikra ba'aleha. So chochma. Bal morav v'rabin, he said. He said morav v'ram, like Mereinu v'Rabbeinu. A guide and a teacher, or yeah. And nevertheless, suddenly we say chochma works the other way around. That the chochma, which is not the nefesh is higher, and yet chochma invigorates it, energizes it. So then came a long explanation. What does this mean? Now, obviously, it's part of the discussion because he wants to show how ba'aleh and chochma, the nefesh, the core soul, and wisdom, intelligence, are interconnected. So not only does the nefesh reside there, hashros ha-nefesh is in chochma, but more than that, chochma actually impacts the nefesh. And that comes the next discussion, which is more avodadik, but it still helps us understand this whole topic, because what we're trying to understand here is how the koiches hanefesh, specifically seichel, on one hand, is like a lavush, but on the other hand, it's a expressive of what the nefesh is like. It reflects the nefesh. I want to just say one more thing, which I mentioned, but I want to just repeat it. You see, even medically and biologically, all the faculties, all the koiches, and the entire human being is controlled by the central nervous system, which begins in the brain. So the mind is the controlling factor, like the central nervous system. Like we spoke Rosh Hashanah, Rosh Chodesh. What's a Rosh? It's not just the head and the beginning, it's the controlling force. So that all the nerves flow from the spinal cord, which is rooted in the brain and the mind. And the same thing is everything you do, even midas, an emotion also needs the mind it all goes through the mind. So in a way, it's like the nefesh is an energy force that's beyond structure, beyond koiches. It, so to speak, settles into the mind, specifically Chochma, the seichel, and from there it directs and guides and governs the rest of the whole body. So we learned this in the Maimorim of Rosh Hashanah. Rosh Hashanah is not just the first day of the year, Tchilas Hashanah, it's also the central nervous system, that when you do Rosh Hashanah will control all the days of the year, because kulam klulim b'hareish. There's an expression that like all the faculties and all parts of the body all originate in the brain, the mind. The same thing, the days of the year in time, in Zman, all originate and are included, encompassed in the Reish Klali. So even though he doesn't say these words, he said it in the beginning. He did say Reish, Moyach, he said Moyach Rashbi, he said these words. It's Mokir, Hareish l'kol ha'keiches, v'klei ha'nefesh, which means it's the head. Essentially, it's the head and the central nervous system, if you wish. It's like the control chamber, the control, what did it say? Mission control. Everything is controlled from the brain. And the brain, the mind, is where the nefesh works through. I'm elaborating on this because it's relevant to what we're going to speak about now, a little further down, when he speaks from the Tanya, which I'm going to explain now. Okay. So now he explains, so what's this Chochma Techai Ba'alel? To say that Chochma is the dwelling place of the soul, fine. Look, in Tanya, he says, in Perek Tes, he says that the Nefesh Elikis is Mishkona. It resides in the Moyach, and from there goes to the right side of the heart. The Nefesh Abamis resides in the left side of the heart. So you see the concept already there. But there he's talking about Nefesh Elikis, Nefesh Abamis. Here he's talking about the Nefesh in general. So fine. So now comes the question, but that's one thing. It dwells there. But once you say Chochma Techai Ba'alel, you're saying Chochma does something for the Nefesh that the Nefesh in a way doesn't have on its own. What does it do for it? So he explains this with the two Tanyas. One Ageres Akedah Siman Dalet, and the second is the Tanya Perek Yud Zayin. And he begins. The thing is, when the Nefesh comes down to the body, it gets into a state of Golus V'Shivya, exile and captivity. In the words of the Maimed here, he says, Ki mitzad eridus haneshama beguf, haguf mastir al mehusav atzmusa. So this soul, where in heaven it was glowing and shining and illuminating, as it comes into a body and an animal, and in this world, it is concealed and covered up, this mehusav atzmusa of the nefesh. And he says, Yashlemer, like it says in the Ageres Akedah Siman Dalet. So let's go over this slowly, even though it's a review, but it's worth reviewing in detail, and then we're going to go through the Tanya, and the line yesterday I said that I didn't understand. Now I believe I figured it out once I looked into the Tanya. So he says, in Siman Dalet, in Ageres Akedah, he says, Pnimius nekudas alev b'chinas golas v'shivya b'levushim tzeyim v'tayvus elam hazim. The inner core, or the inner point of the heart, the Kudus Halev, is in a state of exile and captivity, in soiled or dirty garments, and the taivus, the desires of this world. And he says, from that Ageres Akedah says that Rebbe Rashav, it's understood, that's Pnimius Halev. But Chitzenius Halev, paradoxically, he Yeser Bizgalus is more revealed when the neshama comes down below. Or at least it's easier to reveal it. So that too can be analyzed. What's the difference between more revealed or easier to be revealed? But regardless, the bottom line is it's not as trapped. And the reason for that is, he's going to explain. I'm sorry. So he says, what is this Chetzenis Halev? Shezeh b'chinas hamechin v'amidus. Moshe benakol yesh lahavi l'deis gals b'chinas Chetzenis Halev. Shezeh b'chinas hamechin v'amidus. So Chetzenis Halev is the mechin and midus of the faculties. In other words, the nefesh itself, the core soul, is in exile and in captivity. But the faculties of the soul, which is the meyach and the midus, which he calls Chetzenis Halev, that is not. That's more accessible. The tzrichim leimer, and the Rebbe Rashab says an interesting expression. You have to say that this is understood, that like according to what it says in Perikut Zayin and Tanya, ki meichei b'reshusei v'yochel is beinen bei. There the Alter Rebbe begins the chapter in concluding the first section in Tanya. He says, so what means karev elecha dover me'ed b'ficha b'lvavcha la'seisei, especially b'lvavcha, karev elecha dover me'ed to every person? He says, you see b'muchash, and he says the Torah is nitzchi, so it's relevant to every one of us, to all of us. You see, b'muchash it's not easy and accessible, karev elecha, to reach the heart. And his answer is that yes, what's accessible is not to awaken the heart in the full sense of the word. What's accessible is these words, because the person, the mind is in your control, what you're going to contemplate on. The yachal is beinen bei kechol asher yachpitz. And you can contemplate kechol shvet, whatever you desire, is in your control. Golus does not affect that. You have control over your avodah. Okay, that's the Tanya. Now, in reading the Tanya, I'm going to Tanya Perikut Zayin before we continue on, because I believe here that Rebbe Rashab is giving us a very unique, and I would say illuminating perspective on Tanya Perikut Zayin that I have not seen anywhere else. I looked up all the commentaries. Nobody brings this as the Rebbe Rashab does. So this is the question he asks. He says, I'm reading Tanya Perikut Zayin. Is not something that it doesn't seem reflective of what our reality, of what we tangibly see. The Torah is eternal, so means it must be relevant to us. It's not very close, right? Not very easy to transform a person's heart from the desires of this world to loving God, with a truly loving God. He goes on, he brings proofs that we see it's not easy. So what does he mean? So first he responds, he says, you're talking about la seise. The goal here is that it's accessible, it's easy to bring it into action, even if it's not revealed in the flaming fire inside of him. We continue reading in Tanya. This thing is karev me'ed, very easy or very accessible or very relevant, but nakal and easy for every person. Anyone has a brain and a mind in his a brain in his head, in his skull. Here's the lashon. Because his mind is in his reshus. I'm just comparing. Yeah, the yochel is beinen bei kechol. Oh wow. Here he says, in Tanya he says, B'cheil, Asher Yachpitz.
Kechoil.
In Tanya?
Yeah.
B'cheil.
Kechoil. I have Tanya in front of me.
So do I. Let me look here. You know what? I have one version here says Bakel, but the regular Tanya, you're right, says Kikail.
Of course.
Asher Yachpitz. Okay. Here's a version that says Bakel. I don't know why. It's weird. Okay.
Doesn't make sense. B'chol asher yachpitz.
I agree, but it says, I'm reading it again, 1 second. Looks to me like a Beis here, this version. Let me see something. 1 second, please.
Some
Okay, Kikol Sheyachpis, fine. Anyway, so that's what it says in Tanya so far. Ukashiyus beinim by Bigdula Saint Save Baruchu, Memele Yelu Demeche Al Koponim Ha'avel Hashem. And when he does that, he has the ability to do so, every person. And when he does that, and he contemplates on God's greatness, automatically this will give birth in his mind, at least, a type of intellectual emotion. Okay. And he goes on to speak about that the Meich Shalta Abative, but he says in Perikut Beis that the Meich naturally has control. Now, so the Rebbe Rashab is using this to explain the Geras HaKedesh Siman Daled, because how could you say Chitzenis Halev is more prone to be revealed than Primis Halev? Because the Chitzenis Halev refers to the faculties, and the Moyach is B'Reshusei. That we have that capacity to use our minds and contemplate, and that automatically will awaken something in emotions, though it's not a full emotion that we don't have control over, as we explained yesterday. So what we have now is that Chochma, as he's going to say a little later, is to Chaye Ba'alach. Because Chochma, Me'ach, the mind can now awaken, as he says at the bottom of the page. I'll go back soon in a moment to where we are in the middle of the page. It can bind you to the Eibishter. And through this, once you stimulate the body, and you excite the body and the animal soul with this wisdom, with this intelligence, through that will be this galus etzem nefesh. So the chochmah works backwards and actually awakens and stimulates and arouses the inner part of the primis halev that he said before in Geras HaKedesh is in a state of exile and concealment. That's the point. But now comes a whole section middle, and it bothered me when we first learned it.
What's the difference between Chayfetz and Ratzon?
I didn't get there yet. I'm not talking about Chayfetz or Ratzon right now. I'm talking about Chochmah and Ba'aleha. And I said I will get back to it, so I'm going to discuss now. So now, this explains Chochmah T'chai Ba'aleha, and he said, and therefore, even though Seichel and Chochmah are lower, not the Nefesh itself, but the Nefesh binds itself to it, and that's why Chochmah has the power to revive and stimulate and awaken the soul. Obviously, it also has the power the opposite way, that if you use your mind in the wrong things, it also causes the Ratzon Sheba Nefesh also to conceal the Elikus in it. He says that at the end, this was on top of page 1165. But now comes an in-between where he explains, to explain this power of Seichel, he now introduces Ratzon. And he makes a contrast. Ratzon does not work this way. Ratzon, being that it is far more the inner wiring of the Etzem HaNefesh, it's Hispashtus HaNefesh. Koyach, remember the Koyach, even though Chochmah is the place where the Nefesh resides, and has an impact on the soul that we're discussing now. It stimulates it, it invigorates it, and so on. But it's still not the soul's natural expression, because it's ultimately a specific faculty. And as such, it's distinguished by Ratzon, between Seichel and Ratzon. And what's the distinction? In the words of the Rebbe Rashab, that we see b'chush, haratzon iyef shelevi elizgalus im lo yeshna laharatzon. If there's no ratzon before, within you, there will not be a ratzon emerging from there. Seichel doesn't have to, you don't have to understand an idea or know something before you know it. It can be a complete, a new chiddush, as we discussed. Ratzon, he says the words, im lo yeshna laharatzon, if it doesn't exist within you beforehand, it's not going to be able to be revealed, because ratzon is a so-called wired-in entity. A person naturally loves their children. For example, we learned earlier in Ayin Beis that the ratzon to love children is the natural love for children is a ratzon atzmi. You can't teach someone to love their children. That's not something you acquire. You have it within you. Sometimes it's hidden, sometimes it's revealed. But if you didn't have that ratzon within you, if it was not part of who you are, it wouldn't suddenly appear one day. So true risainus are things that are yeshne, as he says, and then they emerge. Now they could emerge through being compelled, like we learned earlier, but that or kabbalah sale. In other words, you could force it out of you, but it's still coming from something within you. If you remember, is not that you're forcing and creating a new desire. The whole din is that desire is there, but the Yetzer Hara doesn't let it be activated. So the Keifene says only to reveal it. Sorry about that. That's when it comes to Ratzon. So therefore, if there's no, for example, once the Eibishter sent a neshama into Golus, it is a neshama b'guf. So even though embedded in the neshama is always a Ratzon, or ava mushateres, and a Ratzon atzmi, like he says, nishta vil, nishta ken zayin abgedisim von Elikus, a neshama not he wants and not he can be torn away from Elikus, but it's concealed, because Golus has concealed it. So it's not accessible so easily. You need strong Aveda. So what is accessible easier? Chitzenius halev. Because there it's in your control to use your moyach. That God did not take away from us. He did not stop us from contemplating on godliness. What he blocked is the natural, easy way to just desire godliness. It's, as he said, in a state of Golas V'Shivya. So one of the ways we awaken it is through our Hizbananus, through Moyach Shal Talev, like he says in Perikid Zayin, explains the Ageres HaKedesh. But that is due not because of the Ratzon, because the Ratzon is on its own, as he says, is only, it's Yesh Ratzon. And the second point, that Ratzon is also something you cannot change. When a person has a Ratzon for something, when a desire is a certain way, you cannot shift it or incline it in a different way. He said the only qualification is you can refrain. He can just ignore it. Not refrain, sorry, that's not the right word I wanted to use. He can ignore it and in action go against the will. And in time, that could also affect the desire. But a desire that's a strong desire, that's the way it is, it will not shift.
This is a fascinating theory.
Yeah. I would ask everybody right now not to ask any questions or no comments, because I'm trying to explain this and I want everybody to understand it. And I think any distraction right now will not be helpful. So if you don't mind, and with all respect, just wait till I finish the subject and then everybody can comment and ask whatever you want. Because I'm trying to explain something here that we didn't discuss yesterday. So he says like this. Seichel, on the other hand, like he says, is b'reshusei, that you can bring l'idei galus. In other words, you can actually impact and create a seichel. V'gam yechelim lahatese lahaskil be'efen kach u'be'efen kach. So in other words, rotzen is the way you're wired. You have it in you, then it's there. You don't have it, you can't do anything about it, and you can't change it in general. Seichel is not that way at all. It's in your control. So rotzen resides together with more or less where the etzem hanefesh is, pnimis halev. That's essentially what he's saying. Whereas seichel and the keiches are in the chetzenius halev, which there you do have control over it. Okay. Then he comes another parenthesis, and this is the parenthesis that where the end was the gay what it says in Tanya. Back to the Tanya Perek Yud Zayin. So he says like this. But there's a condition. Since Ratzon is such a factor in a person's life, if the Ratzon is a certain way, it will also block the Seichel. If the Ratzon gets involved and decides it wants something a certain way, then the Seichel is not going to just be free to do whatever it wants. But without the Ratzon, and essentially it's almost like saying Sheichid Ya'aver Einei Chachamim, even though he doesn't say it in the negative way, it could also be the positive way. If a person has a very strong desire for a certain for something specific, it doesn't matter what Seichel is going to be. It's not going to let the Seichel come up with a different svara. The negative side of that is Sheichid Ya'aver Einei Chachamim. If somebody is biased and has already a predetermined Ratzon, the Seichel is not going to shift. So no matter what you argue, it's not going to change the person's will. You see this in the negative side, obviously, when a person has a very strong Ratzon for something, to the point he can be stubborn, and that's it. And Seichel is not going to make a difference. It could also be the other way around. A Ratzon, let's say, a Ratzon atzmi from a Sidus Nefesh. Someone will say, I am connected to godliness by Ratzon atzmi, connected to Ratzon, do not want to separate from godliness. Seichel is not going to change that. It doesn't matter if someone says, 1 second, I have a svara or a theory, maybe another way. I'm just using strong examples. The truth is, in a milder form, it's also true. In other words, Ratzon is far more of a very firm and inflexible position. That's what Ratzon means. I want something. Now, obviously, you can reason with somebody, but if something is a Ratzon strong in a certain area, like he says, if it's not Mu'urav, but if it is Mu'urav, if the Ratzon gets involved, then the Seichel, the statement he made that the Seichel can think in a different way will not be applicable. It's only Bli Yisar v'Saratzon, Yachal Yasaskabel coming from him. And then the Rebbe Rashab adds this line. So he's going back now to the Lashon in Tanya. That's what I missed yesterday. I should have caught it. It was just a few lines earlier. He's going back now and bringing Perek Zayin. The Lashon is Kechol Asher Yachpetz. So what does that mean, Kechol Asher Yachpetz? There he says, remember, in answering the question, he says, Moyech b'reshusei. That's the language in Tanya. Moyech b'reshusei v'yochel ben Kechol Asher Yachpetz. That the Moyech is in your hands. You have control over it, and you can bring it into the picture, and therefore, in some way, karev elecha hadover made even b'levavcha through your moyach. And here suddenly the Rebbe Rashab brings it here. So here's how I understand it, and it's not the only way to understand it. I think there's one or two ways probably, but I'm going to focus on the one I think is most seemingly. The Yachpetz is the lashon usually used for Ratzon. It's like saying kol asher yirtzeh. Yachpetz is chayfetz. Chayfetz is usually associated with Ratzon. So the Rebbe Rashab is qualifying and asking a question on himself. You just told me that the Ratzon can be involved if the Seichel is going to have the Reshus to think to whatever it wants to think, whatever it wants to understand. So why does he use the word kechol sheyachpetz? Kechol sheyitzitz, as like the mind can contemplate on something, whatever it desires, whatever it wishes. We just said Ratzon would control the mind, not the other way around. So that's why he says Nira Lemer Hakavona, Nira Hakavona, Nira, that the meaning in that word here is Gam Baratzon Hanelam or Gam Bechitzenis Haratzon Legamri. That the power of the mind cannot change a Ratzon Atzmi, but it could affect in some ways the desire to go in this direction. For example, when you contemplate on God's greatness, so therefore then you start desiring it. So you can contemplate whatever is in your control, but it's just say to contemplate whatever you want. And that in turn has some effect also on the Ratzon Hanelam, but not on the Ratzon Atzmi. Or on he says, Oi, or something that's external altogether. So therefore, it's not a contradiction. In other words, the mind can direct the will. As we see, that's what happens when you contemplate and you awaken the desire for godliness, and to the point that it could also awaken the inner desire, Pnimius Halev, which is in Golus. That seems to me what he's trying to qualify here. I can't say 100%, but it sounds like it. Now, before I conclude here, and I'd love to hear what your thoughts are on this, it really, I began to think, because it's always bothered me. It is an expression in Perikid Beis in Tanya. He says these words. By Moyach Shalta Alev, he says, Ki Moyach Shalta Alev, the mind controls the heart. B'teldose v'tevi yitzirase. In the nature and the very nature of how we were created, Shekach netzer adam b'teldose. This is how a human being was shaped and created from birth. Shekol Adam, and listen to this, every person, Yachol b'ritzeinei shebemeche, li'sapik ulimshal beruach taivase shebelive. Now, he's saying the word meyach shalat alev. Why does he bring b'ritzeinei shebemeche? The desire in his mind. What does that mean? We know Ratzon is higher than meyach, than intelligence. Why does the Alter Rebbe use the word b'ritzeinei shebemeche? I think he uses it again. Give me a second. I think he uses it again the next page. I'm almost sure. Regardless, he uses it here. What does that mean? So thinking about it, now I'm thinking that maybe that's what he's hinting to when he says Kechel Asher Yachpetz, and the Rebbe Rashab is focusing on that. Because Moyach does affect the Ratzon, but not the Ratzon Atzmi, either the Ratzon Hanelam or also the external Ratzon. So bottom line is the Ratzon Atzmi, no matter what your mind is going to say, it's not going to change whether you should love your children or whether you should love God or not, for a moment. However, that's the Atzmi part, because that's how it is, that's how you're wired. The question is whether it's revealed or not. And that needs work. On the other hand, Moyach does affect Ratzon, the Ratzon Shebemeche, which means that the Moyach has a certain aspect of Ratzon within it, but it's more the Chitzenis HaRatzon, or he calls here Ratzon Hanelam, which I'm not really sure what he means by Ratzon Hanelam, but it seems to me this is the direction, and that would explain the words that he says, Kechol Asher Yachpetz, that in other words, your mind allows you to think in whatever you desire. So it's a type of Ratzon that emerges from the Seichel. If the Seichel is not controlled and in any way affected by the Ratzon, like he said a few lines before, that the Ratzon, if it gets mixed in, the Seichel will not be able to be flexible and think in a different way. If you remove that aspect of Ratzon, so then the Chochma, the Seichel, has an aspect that it could go in many different directions as you desire. I don't know if I'm, one second. I am not positive that this is what he's saying, because you could also slug the whole thing up. You could say that whatever I just said is all based on a premise that Yachpitz is referring to Ratzon. But Pastus, when you read the Tanya, he's just saying, it's just an expression. He's saying that a person can contemplate whatever he desires. In other words, it's a Rishusei. Even if you're in Golis, you can think about God. No one took away that Rishus from you. And therefore, it's Benakil, Kolodam. Every person can use their mind to think as they wish, just like if they could think in negative things. You can think about God and awaken emotions. That's why Chitzenius Alev has the capacity to be revealed, because you control your faculty. You don't control your Ratzon. That's essentially, so you could say that's all he means. Who says he's talking here about Ratzon? But then I wonder, then how does it fit to the end of this parentheses? He just finished before the line before. And then he qualifies and says, it's not necessarily a question even. So why is he bringing Yachbitz if it's not connected to Ratzon? How does it fit into this end of this parentheses? That's why I'm suggesting this explanation that I'm saying now. By no means is this definitive. It's just my thoughts. After yesterday, I said I'd give it more thought. So I'm sharing those thoughts. Now,
I don't understand. What is what?
Anyway, I just spoke for around half hour.
No, I heard what you said.
Is there something I said?
Right
one second. I have to stop you. Is there something specific that I said you don't understand, or you don't understand anything I said?
I understood everything that you said, but I think that it's not correct. I think.
Well, you have an alternative explanation?
No, I don't. But
how do you show that mine is wrong? Because
the whole entire thing that you said about Kehol Asher Yachpitz, Kehol Asher Yirtze, Adrabe, Kehol Asher Yachpitz is stronger. He wants to say.
I'm asking why? How are you so? If you don't have an alternative explanation, how are you so sure that what I said is not correct?
I'm not sure, but it doesn't sound to me that Kehol Asher Yachpitz is different from Kehol Asher Yirtze. It's verkehrt.
Who said it's different? It's the same teichen. I said Yachpitz and Yirtze is synonymous.
Okay, I'm not arguing, but
well, listen. Let's put it this way. I gave my suggested explanation. If you have a better one or alternative one, by all means. If not. That's it. That's what I have to say right now about the topic, and I think it connects to the Sena Shebemeche, and we can move on. Anybody have any comments or questions or
you say that
an alternative way to understand it?
You say that is what you're saying, that the Seichel actually can choose a Ratzon and jump on that, as long as it doesn't violate the inbred Ratzons that you have, like to have a bias for Hulu. But actually, the Seichel has tons of Ratzon. It could choose one and develop that one. There's tons of Ratzons, probably. I mean, I imagine it. Tell me if I'm wrong.
Well, that's part of what I'm saying, because Kechela Sheyachbetz means that you can think whatever you desire. You have control. Like he says, that's the words he uses. He says, Yochel is Beinabei, that he has Meiche B'Reshusei. Let's go over the words again. Meiche B'Reshusei. His mind is in his control. So B'Reshusei of the person. You have control over it. And V'Yochel is Beinabei. You can contemplate with the mind, in the mind, as you see fit, as you desire, without any limits, unless the Ratzon comes and imposes itself, like he said, there's a service. If you have a particular Ratzon a certain way, it won't let you go any direction. But as long as you don't have that Ratzon, inbred Ratzon, as you put it, then the Seichel can go and, yes, create and develop any Ratzon you want, including, once it contemplates, in this case, on the greatness of God, of godliness, it can awaken, at least in the mind, some feeling. And that's why Karev Elecha, Dover Meid, Beficha B'Lvavcha, because you have the control in your mind. Like I said yesterday, Vasiresi Leva Evan. You can remove your mind, and that's what Chabad is all about. Even if your heart is blocked, and even though we're in Golis, and emotionally we don't feel Eined Mulvade, yet we can learn Chassidus. Look, we're doing it right now. We're learning Chassidus. We're learning about Elikus. We don't necessarily feel it through and through as we feel Eilam Hazeh. The physical world definitely has a much more stronger hold on us, but we can use our minds, and you can learn the deepest concepts of the highest levels in godliness. Lifnei Tzimtzum. You can learn about Elikus B'Pshittus, that everything is godliness. Even though in real action, in real life, we don't feel it and we don't experience it, but we can, the mind is in your control. So the mind is essentially creating a ratzonus, if you want to put it that way. He doesn't say those words literally, but he definitely says it creates something. And he uses the word yachpitz. And then he says, nira kavana an rotzen. So he means that yachpitz must be either rotzen hanelam. He says, nira gamba rotzen hanelam, or gamba chitzenius harotzen legamri. So I'm thinking to myself, that's what it's mean. That the moyach can control a rotzen too, when you're dealing with nelam or chitzenius, not rotzen atzmi. Because the rotzen atzmi obviously is in golus. However, we're going to learn a few lines afterwards that it also affects that. He says that then, and he says clearly that it can affect the rotzen mishtanu misalim boy. The key word on the top of the next page, that when you're mizbeinen, when you when you apply your mind to godly matters, you can elevate the nefesh and reveal in it the rotzen alaki, which was in golus. And he says, that's because the nefesh manifests within the seichel and unites with it. So even though the seichel be'etzem is a koyach, but it has some type of power that can affect in return the soul that resides in it. And I would say not just the soul, but the desire, which is an expression of the soul. So it can create a desire, and it could also awaken the innate and inbred desire for godliness that's in there that was in Golus. That's how I would probably explain it in the fullest sense. The more I think about it, actually, the more it sounds that's the way he means. Now, what he means, Rotzen Hanelam, not positive, but I have to think about the difference between Notzim and Chitzenis HaRotzen. Let's put it this way. I'm suggesting this explanation. I am not in any way negating if someone has an alternative one or a better one, by all means. But right now, let's put it this way, I'm satisfied enough to be able to move on. And I'm going to think about it more. Maybe something will come up. I'm going to look at more, study the Tanya and so on, and what means the Rotzen and the Moyach. But clearly, Rotzen being Keser and Moyach being Chochma, there's clearly something going on. So Nefesh would be even higher than Keser, the Etzem HaNefesh. Then comes Keser's Rotzen. We know Keser and Chochma interact. There are things in Keser that are inbred, and Chochma does not change. But there are things in Keser, like Chitzenis HaKeser, Chitzenis HaRotzen, or Rotzen HaNelam, that are impacted by Chochma. And impact Chochma, Chochma Stima. Remember, we learned also, if you remember back a few pages, he said, when he spoke about compelling someone to Acha Emer Reitzani, what is that? He said that you can compel someone and reveal through Yigiyah, through effort, you can reveal a desire that's already there. So clearly there's ways to elicit the desire that's in Keser. Clearly Chochma has a way of creating a Rotzen, which would explain also another thing. We were learning all the time that Rotzen, either you have it or you don't have it. But one second, we can convince somebody, I can come to you and say to you, listen, I know you don't want to do something. You don't want to learn Chassidus. But I can, and then I explain to you why it's important to learn Chassidus. And you know what? You're convinced, and your Moyach speaks to your Rotzen, and it awakens a Rotzen. Now there you could say maybe it's a Rotzen Atzmi, maybe not. But regardless, or I can come and say to you, listen, I want you to invest with me in a business. You'll say, I'm not interested. I have no Rotzen. I don't see any reason to do so. Then I make a good case, a presentation. And what happens is not only do I convince you with Seichel, the Seichel in turn says, you know what? I'm in. I want to do it. So that explains a whole different level of Rotzen. That's not the Rotzen we're talking here. Because here we're talking about a Rotzen, he says, either it's there or it's not there. Because he's talking about a Rotzen Atzmi. But a Chetzenis Rotzen, a Rotzen Anelam, that is in our control. Someone can convince someone with Seichel to create a desire for something. But it's not the Primis Rotzen. It's not the Rotzen that he's talking about higher up, where he says the rotzen telakus. Doesn't come through seichel. There, the seichel can awaken it and can ignite it, like you said, can invigorate it. Chochma techaya ba'aleha. I think helps explain this whole thing with rotzen, the lower level of rotzen.
Rabbi, may I make a comment?
Sure, go ahead.
I may be oversimplistic explanation of this, but the way I see it is, I think with Tzaddikim, the difference between us and Tzaddikim is just that at the main Ratzon, at the Panemius Ratzon, we're all the same. The Tzaddik has the same frequency of the Chetzonius and the Panemi of the Ratzon. That's why they're living godliness on earth. They show exactly what everything is. For us, at the Panemius level, we are all the same. However, based upon our experiences being in Galut and all that, our frequency of the external Ratzon is different. And through Avodah and by seeing the Tzaddikim, how they conduct and how it should be, then maybe we can bring these two frequencies to be the same. And once we do that through Avodah, that's how we could connect. That's why we have the same ability to be able to reach the highest level as a Tzaddik would, although being for him is innate and both frequencies are the same. But for us, we have to do Avodah and we have to do contemplations and be able to make these two frequencies the same.
Yeah, I agree with that entirely. I'll even reinforce that in the chapter 17 in Tanya that we're addressing here. He actually begins and says that. He says, Tzadikim dafke libam bereshusam. Dafke tzadikim, their heart is in their control. It says, Rishayim, wicked people, their heart is in control. But heim bereshus libam. In other words, the emotional impulses are in control. And a tzaddik is the opposite. He is in control of his emotional impulses, which only adds to the question, then how could you say karev elecha davar me'ed? It's only for tzaddikim. And that's exactly the context here. That he tells us we can reach moyach shalit ala lev, not on the innate level, like you said, primius, that level. We can go to the outer rotzen. And there, that's where we can impact through our determination and our mind controlling our hearts through effort. The tzaddik doesn't need moyach shal ta'alev because he's in that place already. His heart is in his control already. He's achieved mastery over his emotions. A rasha has not achieved mastery, the emotions control him. What we have the capacity to do is moiche bereshusei. That's the in-between stage where we can use our minds to align ourselves. And what you said is accurate too, that we have to work on it to align it, ultimately to join those two frequencies, as you put it. Yes, that is correct. So basically you have three levels. The Rebbe Rashab says this in a Maimer Kikorev Elecha Ayin Ches. You have one is tzadikim libam bereshusam. They control their emotions. Arasha, another extreme, bereshus libam. They are under the control of their emotions. And the Beinani, or the average person, each of us has the capacity through effort of moyach shalat alev, to use your mind to somewhat tame or at least control and guide your heart. So when you have, let's say, a taiva, a desire that the rasha would succumb to, that tzaddik would not even allow it to affect because he's in control of his emotions, the middle level, which is each one of us, kol adam, he says, kol adam, can always access. You can always, what's the word I want to use? Generate and activate your mind to come into play. And that's where the mind becomes such a powerful force, because it can help you control yourself and help you control your heart and emotions. Yeah, that's correct.
So that means that the seichel is poel of the rotzen?
Well, listen, when a person, let's say, has a taiva belibe, let's talk practically. You have a desire for something. Then you activate what the Alter Rebbe says, moyach shalat alev. So though you have a rotzen for a taiva, your moyach now is controlling that impulse and that desire for that, and it's creating a desire for godliness. at least in the mind, as he puts it, even if it doesn't impact your whole heart. And a chitzenius halev, it impacts to some extent that now there's a rotzen for a lakus, like he says. So yes, the answer would be moyach. That's why he calls the word. If you look in Perikut Beis, I said the Now, what that means is can mean a lot of things. It could be the rotzen and the moyach. It could also be that the moyach, in a sense, is now, so to speak, creating a desire. Because remember, if the desire that is an atzmi that comes into play, then we have a different issue, like he explained. But if you don't have any desire being mixed into the flow here, that's what happens. That's probably what he means. That's what I'm translating means kechela sheyachbitz. But as I said,
and even b'chinas harotzen hanelam instead.
He says nira kavana. Yeah. So what's he qualifying? I think he wants to say not rotzen atzmi. That's how I was explaining it.
Rabbi Jacobson.
Yeah, but the seichel is spoil also on rotzen hanelam, not only b'chitzenius harotzen, nor even b'rotzen hanelam.
Well, I don't know if I'd read that, because read the next line. Oigam b'chitzenius harotzen. So in other words, which one is higher, which one's lower? I'm not sure what he means by rotzen hanelam, to be honest. I think that it seems to me the fact that it says Oigam b'chitzenius harotzen legamri sounds to me that's stronger than rotzen hanelam. Or else, what would he mean oigam afterwards? He should have said in the other order. Nira kavona chitzenius gam chitzenius harotzen. Oy gam b'rotzen hanelam. So it sounds to me rotzen hanelam is more that in some way it's affecting some hidden rotzen. I have to think about that more. What's the difference between rotzen hanelam and chitzenius? I said I'm not clear what that is, but I think that's the havana. Yeah, go ahead. Someone wanted to ask something.
Yeah, Rabbi Jacobson. A couple of things. First of all, in Lessons in Tanya, it's written bechol, not kachol. In the Rabbi Weinberg's 5-volume set, it says v'yachol litbonem bo bechol asher yachpotz.
It doesn't say
with the base.
Tanya. In the Tanya itself, it doesn't say bechol.
Yes, in this. Okay, maybe that. What I'm just saying.
I just told you. I also saw a version where it says bechel.
So
but I think the corrected version is kichel.
Of course.
But I'm just saying that in this famous the 5-volume set, there was a mode.
I just told you. I read from another version that it says bechel. So maybe there's some Tanyas. Maybe there's a mistake. I'm not sure.
Yeah, it looks like a mistake.
Because the Rebbe Rashab for sure quotes kichel. Right. In the Tanya that I have here, it says kichel. Here I have a version that says bechel. So I have to look it up. You have to look it up a bit more.
Okay.
I'm looking in the back of Tanya. The Rebbe has corrections. Let me see something. Let me see if there was ever a version that said kechel, bachel, rather. In Hebrew, digduk is not correct, bachel, right?
Of course.
What would mean bechel asher yachpetz? What would have any meaning or sekleptish?
No, it has a meaning. He could think about what he wants, but the idea here is that he could think in any different way. He could use this maneuver, the seichel, in every way that he wanted. But if you say bechoil means, you could think about everything that you want. That's not the idea that we want to speak here.
You know what? Give me a second. Give me 1 second. I'm looking in the Madura Kama of Tanya. You know, we have a Madura Kama. You're familiar with this book, with the Sefer?
No.
Yeah.
Well, Madura Kama, the Rebbe published in Beis, I think. Let me see there a second. There, all the different manuscripts of Tanya were compared, and there was an earlier version. So I want to just see what it says there, if you don't mind. Interesting. I'm looking at Perikut Zayin. Oh boy. You're not going to believe this. You know what it says here? Neither bakoil or kakoil. It says, the yochel is bein by kol asher yachpetz. Kol. Not bechoil or not kuchel.
Oil means bakoil.
But it says koil here, for sure. I'm looking here. Let me just see if they have a footnote on this. 1 second. Here we go. Can I read a footnote to you? It says like this. Here it says koil in Madura Kama, the first version the Alter Rebbe wrote. In a footnote, the editor's right. In printed, in the Tanya printed, it says ka koil. Neitzah's Vilna, Tofresh Ayin Beis, in one edition in Ayin Beis, actually Ayin Beis, it printed by mistake, Betah is bakoil. Umemena nafla ta'azu bekama v'kama hitzahas kahas. And from there, this mistake was repeated in many different editions by kahas. You want to hear another ksav yad that says la koil. La koil asher yachpetz.
This is, of course,
Okay.
makes sense.
Yeah, it says la koil, and then the writer crossed out the lamed. Interesting, huh?
So what's the correct one?
Kachel, with the chaf. It's very clear. There was a mistake in some versions, but it should be kachel.
Can I make two suggestions?
Absolutely. Go for it.
Chayfetz, I'd say as a difference between chayfetz and ratzain, chayfetz could be like more of a spontaneous desire that's born out of the mayach, and ratzain would be on the etzem nefesh.
No, exactly the opposite. Chayfetz is deeper than Ratzon.
Hold on a second. This is not guesswork. Chassidus talks about it very explicitly.
Okay.
Chassidus talks about chayfetz and ratzon. Sometimes they're synonymous. Sometimes chayfetz is pnimius haratzon, and ratzon is chitzenius haratzon. I don't know if we could be medayik here at all, because the Rebbe Rashab is not being medayik, so I don't know. Bringing in other maimarim here would be helpful. He says here yachpetz, and he teaches. He says ratzon hanelim or hizgal or gil chitzenius haratzon. So so I think there's some places maybe chayfetz is even lower than ratzon. Anyway, what's your point?
It seems like he's deciding to move in a certain way. He's making the chayfetz here is making a decision.
What are you talking about? He says chayfetz here means ratzon hanelim or chitzenius haratzon. So what are you changing that? You want to change the?
He's deciding to go with the
I'm saying the Rebbe
Rashab, or
explain to me. I'm not sure what you're saying. The Rebbe Rashab teaches yachpetz ratzon hanelim. He says nida kavona or chitzenius haratzon. What are you adding to that?
I mean, the way I understood it, that the pnimius haratzon is the neshama's etzem desire to be connected with Hashem, and the chitzonius haratzon is the desire of the nefesh habahamis.
So where did you get that? First of all, where does he say that here?
In the beginning, it's being hidden. Its etzem desire is being hidden.
Where do you get that chitzenius haratzon is about nefesh habahamis? Anyway,
so where does it say about taivus, levushim tzayim v'taivus elam hazeh?
That's why it's nister, because the neshama goes down below into a body and an animal soul. Therefore, it's the etzem is concealed.
So then the levushim tzayim are the chitzonius haratzon, no?
Where did you? That's a very big jump. Where does he say that here? Anywhere? The only place he uses chitzonius haratzon is kechel asher yachpetz in Tanya, which is contemplating on whatever you want to contemplate on. So I'm not sure where you get the chitzonius haratzon is
What I see here is saying
it says chitzonius halev. It doesn't say chitzonius haratzon. Anyway, it's very noisy. I don't know if it's on your end.
Yeah, it's
So-
on my end.
Okay, so listen, I'm not sure what you're trying to say. You want to explain yourself by all means, but I'm not getting what you're saying. What are you trying to say?
But I'll have to get back to you a little bit later.
Okay, so we'll stop here. We reviewed basically,
Rabbi
we didn't
Jackson,
learn anything new. We just reviewed what we learned. I mean, we didn't learn new material, that is.
could I ask you 2 questions, Rod, or you want to end? You want to end
Excuse
right now? Or can I ask you 2 more questions?
Let me just, one second, I'm going to end the recording here. So we're stopping here, reviewed page 1164, especially the Tanya chapter 17 about